Good morning. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Eclipse JNoSQL, or in the very near future, it should be renamed slightly to Jakarta EE NoSQL or simply Jakarta NoSQL, but we'll come to that. So, a little bit about myself. I'm also in the Jakarta EE Specification Committee as a committer representative. I'm spec lead of the JSR 385, the version 2 of units of measurement, and also involved in a lot of JSRs, Apache or Eclipse projects and other open source projects. So, how many of you are working with NoSQL databases or have worked with them already? Okay, yeah, quite a few. So, some of the paradigm changes and differences with NoSQL that usually it's unstructured, or the structure can differ quite a lot. In most cases there are no transactions. It uses the base as opposed to ACID mechanism of consistency. And at the moment there are 5 main types of databases or systems. I just heard from one of the exhibitors out there that they actually would not like to call their system DB, but because of marketing, and it's such a common term that they still ended up using the term DB. So one is key value with systems like Amazon Dynamo or S3, Redis or Hazelcast as some of the most popular examples. Then there are column-based systems like HBase, Cassandra, SimpleDB or DynamoDB. Others are document-based. In most cases, these documents are stored in JSON. In theory, it could also be something else like XML, but in recent years, JSON has become more popular, like Apache CouchDB, which is based on Couchbase or the commercial Couchbase, or MongoDB, of course. Then we have graph-based solutions like Neo4j, Infogrid, Zones, or HyperGraphDB. And then there are multi-model solutions where some of these systems allow to combine different paradigms. For example, OrientDB combines graph and document-based approaches. Couchbase combines document with key value. ArangoDB combines 3 of them, actually. Or Elasticsearch, which also combines a document and graph-based approach. What are some of the main differences of each of these approaches compared to traditional SQL? There are certain terms that some of them may exist, for example, column, but others do not exist. And in case of the column, you also see that certain types of non-SQL systems also use the term column, but it may often mean something slightly different than in the traditional SQL model. The consistency models and mechanisms to achieve consistency are also slightly different. NoSQL systems usually use what's called BASE, basically available, soft state and eventual consistency, as opposed to the ACID approach of most relational database systems, which stands for atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability. Oops. The scalability versus complexity is also done differently by different types of NoSQL systems. So the key value based systems are usually very scalable, while some of the others can become quite complex depending on your data model, of course. So that's an important aspect to take into consideration when you choose either a particular system or simply a family and an approach for doing NoSQL. While the relational database approach and database systems usually had the traditional frameworks and APIs, DAO layer, then persistence mapping via JPA or Hibernate or some other object relational database mapping, and underneath that, on the lower level, they're usually based on JDBC. In the NoSQL approach, there are currently several APIs. In some cases, there are actually no APIs. In others, there are APIs, but they are usually quite different from vendor to vendor. So it's not so easy to switch from one system to another if, for example, your project finds out that in the course of the development you need to switch from one to the other, or you may prefer to use one for the test stage or during development because it's more flexible, but in production you might like something else where the commercial support is better. That usually isn't so easy with all the proprietary and very different types of APIs. There are currently a few solutions. Hibernate OGM, which is derived from the object or the traditional relational mapping tool Hibernate. Does any of you have experience with that, or have you used OGM? Okay, yeah. And Toplink, which is one of the predecessors and main influence to the Eclipse Link project, also offers something in that direction, but they are still slightly different and not standardized. Especially Hibernate OGM is very influenced by the JPA side of Hibernate, and therefore some of the JPA approaches are not always perfectly suitable for NoSQL. So as an answer to that, we thought initially about standardizing this as a so-called JSR in the Java community process, but as it happened, all of Java EE has recently moved to Jakarta EE, as you probably heard in some of the other talks the last couple of days. So the JSR idea was considered, but found that it would be a little late now, and it would mean that in the worst case, those parts that would still be accepted as a JSR may then have to be rebranded or repackaged, and in the worst case you would have, for example, one part that's still using the package namespace javax.nosql, and in the next version that would have to change. So we decided together with the Jakarta EE committees and the Eclipse Foundation and the vendors involved that it would actually make more sense to go directly for Jakarta EE, which is going to happen very soon, especially after the conferences at the end of this month. There's both Oracle Code in the US and EclipseCon Europe here in Germany. The path for actually standardizing it under the Eclipse Foundation with Jakarta EE will be late, and JNoSQL is lucky to be the first project that can follow this path. So most of these projects are named after various ancient goddesses and gods. Diana was picked for the main API project for various reasons. The Greek name for Diana is actually Artemis, which for some it may sound a little bit confusing because there's at least the Apache, the new version of ActiveMQ is also called Artemis, but as far as we know there's no branding, and if there is, then for example Jakarta itself was the best example. That was an Apache project in the past, but because it was archived and is no longer actively developed, it was donated and allowed to be used by the Eclipse successor to Java EE. So should there be any issue with the spec project, then there will definitely be a solution, but in most cases there are no real brand names, and there are many projects nowadays where one or the other may have a similar or even identical name. So I hope that's not really a problem. Diana is the API communication layer. Because there are many different systems that often have a different approach or different architecture underneath and use different, not only different acronyms, but often completely different approaches. For example, document-based versus graph-based and others. Here you see 4 examples how these can differ in their own API. That's where JNoSQL tries to combine them under, for example, here a document entity. So the term entity is something that, for those familiar with JPA, we try to preserve as good as it's possible in this particular context. Some of the main terms you can see here, the configuration. There's actually a configuration project that has both a JSR, and there's also a project in Eclipse MicroProfile, and if some of that also makes its way into Jakarta EE soon enough to provide synergies, then potentially the configuration could also be used from another Jakarta EE project. But at least at the moment, because the spec itself is not supposed to be based on other projects like even Eclipse MicroProfile, as long as those are still there, JNoSQL is probably not able to use them. But as soon as, for example, configuration is also available either as a JSR, if the JSR is final, or in a different form, for example, under Jakarta EE, if the Eclipse MicroProfile config spec graduates to Jakarta EE, and I think we have one of the spec leads actually here, so if you have any questions about that during the Q&A, then you're more than welcome to also ask Emily. But at the moment, that's why the configuration is currently still defined by Jakarta EE itself. But if there's a way for synergies, then we are definitely looking forward to make use of those. So here you find, for example, the column configuration and the so-called driver configuration. Column configuration is somewhat inspired by, for example, the entity unit that you find in JPA. There is a lot of diversity with different types of databases and different types of underlying storage formats. Therefore, we also allow, for example, that you can use an actual query which is comparable to JPA query language or plain SQL. But in those cases where it makes more sense, you can also retrieve the information as a Java collection or list. Artemis, in this case, is the project that sits on top of Diana, and the helmet is inspired by the CDI mascot that was recently defined. So it's a little bit like the Gimli dwarf from Lord of the Rings. That's why the Artemis mascot is wearing the same helmet, and Artemis combines CDI by using CDI annotations together with the underlying API of Diana. Here you find some of the most common terms in the CDI layer. So you have annotated entities, templates, repositories. This follows the popular repository pattern from domain-driven design, and the configuration. Again, the configuration is something that in an ideal world we may be able to use synergies with other specs and standards. At the moment the API defines them as is, but we hope that we may be able to use some externalizable configuration via things like the config.jsr or what's currently in microprofile config. So annotated entities, for everyone who knows and uses JPA, this should definitely look quite familiar and also comfortable to use. So the switching from an POJO that has been annotated with JPA to a POJO that uses JNoSQL should be relatively easy. In some cases with very little or no code change. The template mechanism is especially for document-based systems, as you can see here with the document template. Here's an example for the repository. So there are also some participants from the JPA expert group or representatives of Spring and Spring Data that are following the mailing list and made some suggestions. So it is definitely possible that as soon as the standard is set and mature enough that, for example, in a future version you may also see Spring Data use some of that. And here, as you see, the add inject annotation is also something that CDI and Spring share as the most common denominator. So that is something that on this level it should also be possible for Spring to use it as well as CDI. There's support for several different formats, for example, JSON, XML, and YAML. The configuration, as you see, the naming was also picked here, that you see in the names of the member variables, that, for example, the documentation collection manager factory and the documentation collection manager would serve a similar purpose in this case as you would use the entity manager in traditional JPA. So here, again, you see that there's diversity and there are certain annotations that work for particular systems. There's also a plain SQL annotation, which allows you, similar to what you can do in JPA, to do a native query for systems that support this. So that's again something where you don't have to throw everything aboard that you've been using with SQL and queries that were used in via JPA, for example, but that allows an often very gradual migration without throwing all the code away. There's also a query by text. Yeah, the movie example sounds quite appropriate here for doing this talk in a cinema. Here you also see that the term prepared statement is also supported, which goes in a direction where, for example, Hibernate allows this at the moment with its NoSQL module that is very closely inspired and related to JPA. So because Red Hat and Hibernate also consider participating and using this, so Hibernate OGM may be a future implementation of this spec. That's why we also tried to take into consideration what the existing systems do, so that it's not impossible for them to implement the spec. Here's an example how the repository can use embedded queries which feels and behaves quite similar to what JPA is doing right now. Okay, so let's look at some code. So for the sake of simplicity, I have prepared mostly the demos that run Java SE, and with a few exceptions, you can run almost all of them out of the box. So especially Neo4j exists in an embedded version, so it will be instantiated directly in the instance of your code, and you don't need to install a database first. MongoDB is the only exception, that I have a MongoDB service running here on my machine. But for the others that I selected, so Hazelcast and Neo4j work out of the box. MongoDB, you would need to install a MongoDB instance, which you can also get for free. And for some of the others, yeah. So here's the demo parent. You can find the Artemis demo in the JNoSQL repository. So these are some of the parts that have not been migrated to Eclipse Foundation. Some of them may. In other cases, there's probably some IP restrictions where certain libraries or dependencies underneath a particular driver may not always be IP approved yet by Eclipse. So since the drivers are basically third-party extensions, even though a lot of those drivers are now developed under JNoSQL.org, you may see some of them developed and maintained by vendors themselves, like MongoDB, for example, in the future. That's why not everything is now migrated to either Eclipse Foundation in the JNoSQL project or for the spec part in the future Jakarta EE. So you will see mostly what's now the Diana API to contribute to the future spec. Then you will see some part that I guess it's quite likely that one of the compatible implementations may actually also be done under the Eclipse JNoSQL project. And others, of course, are up to vendors. So the Jakarta EE system of doing implementations works very similar to what you may know from the Java community process, but it's not identical, and especially there's no reference implementation. So there has to be at least one compatible implementation, but there can be multiple at the same time. It's not just one that's called the reference implementation. There could be 2 or 3 implementations by different vendors, which is a little less dominated by one vendor, as for example, many of the specs were by Sun and later Oracle. So in this case, with Eclipse, there's more diversity, and you may see several different vendors producing implementations at the same time, including the ones that already do this right now, like Hibernate. So several of these, especially Cassandra, for example, you need to set up the database. For others, including Neo4j or Hazelcast, it works out of the box unless you need clustering and a distributed environment. So let's start with Hazelcast. So here Hazelcast is fired up. And we see the result of the queries down here. I think we have a little more time. It's not yet yellow, or the gentleman with the yellow card has not come back. So let's look at how the code actually works. Is the font size okay also in the very back? Yeah, okay. So you see the user is actually a Pojo in this case. It has a builder, and then the arguments are passed in a very fluent matter. Then in this case, we use the template approach from the SPI. And we let the container select from this template. We put a user, which is, yeah, here you also see that this is comparable to certain approaches and mechanisms in JPA. And when the user was saved successfully, we retrieve it again via template get. We pass the user, This is also similar to typed JPA. Here we use an optional so that null can be handled a little more gracefully than it used to be in JPA and before Java 8. And we see in the first line is the result of the storage we put, and the second line shows the result after we retrieved it again. So let's run a slightly different one with Neo4j. There we go. So what it has in common is the template. In this case, it's a graph template because Neo4j is a graph-based system. So that's where you see that the graph template and the graph mechanism uses slightly different terms here. For example, you can directly access edges of that graph. So this is it's a little bit like in XML, for example, where you have different approaches, and this is probably comparable to something like DOM, where you go directly into the XML graph and you can retrieve a particular node, or certain ways of using JSON processing in the graph and streaming mode. So JSON processing has several different ways of doing this, but one of them is also more like a graph. And then again, here we have the storing and retrieving it. Yeah, the result is formatted in JSON as well. But unlike a document-based system, which we're going to see next, the graph-based approach has certain specialties. But the main concept of the template is used in the same way that you saw before with Hazelcast. Okay, then let's do MongoDB. Yeah, I also have a few variations. Let's see if there's still time, but I guess it's probably just enough for each of these simple demos. So here we use the document template. So what all of these three demos share is they use the template-based approach. But unlike the graph database with certain specialties like traversing through edges and navigating to a particular leaf of the graph, here this is probably, again, the most comparable approach to using traditional SQL. So you can do a query and then you pass certain arguments like a placeholder for a key, and then you do a build. So in some of the cases, of course, this is a little more fluent, using common patterns like the builder pattern. So that's where defining this API now and not 15 to almost 20 years ago has some advantages, and we use these advantages. So we use, at least wherever it's possible and it makes sense, we use new elements of Java 8. So you can also do lambdas quite well with it. We use types like optional, where this makes sense, so you don't get null and don't get null pointer exceptions so easily. And we use the new and often very popular fluent approach, and also patterns like the builder pattern. So here is the part that builds the actual domain object. Here it's an address and some nested elements like the job of that person. Then the person is built with all of these. The document template is created, and the person is saved via template insert. Then we saw the result in the first line. And in the second line, in the lower part, the same person is retrieved again. Okay. Yeah, there are actually some more new slides, so I guess I leave the demo part to these 3 examples, but you saw with 3 different types of NoSQL systems that common API mechanisms like the template work for all 3 of them. So there are certain aspects that are common enough to all of them that can be used in a unified way, and in some cases where it's an advantage to apply specialties. For example, for the graph database, the API is also flexible enough to allow additional mechanisms that are specific to that particular database type. For example, navigating through edges of the graph. So there are lots of providers that are supported already. For each of these, a driver exists, most of them under the JNoSQL umbrella. Some you may also find by the vendor itself. The roadmap, as mentioned, it has slightly changed from where the specification is done, but we are actually in the last part here between Eclipse project and development. So the Eclipse project already exists. Development is also done. The most recent version should be 007. So we sort of may sound like it's downplaying the level of maturity. It's actually quite mature already, but because we prepare an actual specification which will also be somewhere before version 1.0, but we may probably then call it something that's equivalent, like 0.1 or whatever is suitable for the new specification process, which, as I already mentioned, is the Jakarta EE specification process. Atomic Tribe, where Otavio works, has also mentioned it on their blog. Other than that, stay tuned. I'll also share some of the dates and events that take place in the course of this month, both in San Francisco and over here in Ludwigsburg. So the namespace for the Maven coordinates should definitely be Jakarta.NoSQL and most likely the top level package of the spec, because all the specs that used to be JavaX something, for example, JavaX persistence, also became Jakarta persistence with the next version of JPA, and therefore it's quite logical to have Jakarta.NoSQL also as the package name for the spec-related APIs. The others will probably either use org JNoSQL or it may also be org Eclipse JNoSQL. Yes, as I mentioned, on both sides of the Atlantic there will be conferences. Actually, they happen at the same time, which for some smaller project teams it may be a little stressful because the Concorde does not fly anymore, so you cannot do 2 talks on each of them on one day, like Phil Collins once did during the Live 8 concert, I believe. But most of the vendors are big enough, and for the JNoSQL team, I will also do some of the European part, while others, including Ottavio and his fellow colleagues at Tommy Tribe, will do the part in America because they are in America. So there are 3 events during Oracle Code 1. Should you be there at the end of this month? A hands-on lab and 2 conference sessions. Over here on Eclipse Community Day, because there was an official talk at Eclipse Conference, I also proposed the talk, but since this was a little too close to Eclipse Conference, they did not put it into the main program. But nevertheless, especially because it's the official blueprint for Jakarta EE, and joining the Jakarta EE specification, I was invited to do a presentation on JNoSQL on the Eclipse Community Day. That's Monday the 22nd. So if you're here in Germany and if you already attend EclipseCon Europe, then I think the Community Day might be free. I'm not entirely sure if it's free or if you still have to pay separately, but even if you don't go to EclipseCon Europe and you have time, then you're more than welcome to join the Community Day. I think it costs only 50 euros or so plus tax. So you're more than welcome to participate and learn not only something more about JNoSQL, but also about how it integrates with Jakarta EE and how Jakarta EE itself will look like. And there are also a lot of other projects, including MicroProfile done by Heiko, who's also based in Stuttgart. So here are the main links. The old page, I don't think it will go away. It's pretty much like MicroProfile also has the microprofile.io entry page. So I don't think this will go away anytime soon. On GitHub, you find all the JNoSQL related projects under the Eclipse Foundation. There's a mailing list. You're more than welcome to subscribe if you're interested or you want to contribute to it. There's a Gitter chat room for instance messaging, and JNoSQL also has a page on the Eclipse wiki. Okay, so not sure how many minutes there are left, but hopefully 1 or 2 questions if you have questions. Do we have a mic down here or? Any questions? Should I bring it or do you want to bring it? It's in the way back. certain elements we do, of course, because mm, 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 yeah. Well, you definitely have to also remember that this is not the final or not even the actually proposed Jakarta EE spec. And if there are certain things in the spec definition, if you're already an Eclipse committer or Eclipse member, then please participate and share those concerns or suggestions. And there are already certain elements in the API right now that don't work for others. So there are only a few very generic nodes, like for example the template, but it has subclasses that are then specific to others. So there are certain things, even if they all derive from template, if you try to do something that works with the graph template and you try to apply the same to the document template, it will not work. So just because they all have a common parent, it's a bit like all objects in Java being object, but it still doesn't mean they are fully compatible with each other. And there are certain API elements that only work for a particular type. But if there's some more separation that you feel might be suitable, and we also got a few suggestions with regards to naming things differently from Spring and Spring data, please, if you're an Eclipse committer of whatever kind, either you represent a company or you're an individual, then please participate, join the Eclipse Foundation, and join the Jakarta EE spec and the project and make suggestions, either on the mailing list, or if you have more detailed suggestions, then please also do in the repository and do pull requests or something similar. We would very much appreciate that. As I said, the spec is just beginning, and it's all of you are welcome to also participate in the specification process or in helping to define that API. It's not just for us to say this is something in our ivory tower that we think is best. That may have been similar in the past, where only a few vendors said like, oh yeah, we want this API. This is like, that's also something that I think I mentioned on the slide, that these specifications are a code first approach, and in the code we can actually find out if something that some vendor may have thought in one way, another one thinks it's better in a different way, and then we will definitely find a compromise and make the specification work best for the majority of the community. Another one? Mm-hmm. Well, you saw with these three examples, although they are very small, so things like transactions would have exceeded the scope of the slides and the live demo code, but there are of course compromises, but it's the same, for example, where in traditional JPA, there are certain things when something is too specific that the API cannot cover it, then you have to use, for example, a native query in SQL with selects. And that for all the types that support this is also an alternative here. So there are things where you can also go to a more native way, for example, via query languages, but still use the API, but then do this in a native query, which is somewhat similar to what you do in JPA, where you may also lose, for example, type safety in some cases, but you're more flexible to do the query through a plain text. Transaction, of course, is something that very much depends on if the transactional paradigm is supported. Then for some of them, we plan to use JTA wherever it's suitable, because that's part of the Jakarta EE family, and NoSQL also will be. But for systems where transactions don't exist, you'll probably also not be able to use JTA then. Okay, I think we are pretty much done. Any last question? No? Yeah, then thanks a lot for coming, and maybe see some of you in Ludwigsburg again at Eclipse Community Day, and those who want to help make this first Jakarta EE specification, I don't want to say great again, but make it great, please participate.